Well, there's been a great deal of panic, folly, coronavirus, and all the rest of it under the bridge since last we foregathered. This is the long-delayed second episode of The Writing Life. Good luck, hang on tightly. Not so very long ago, I had occasion to engage on social media in a colloquy with a nice, well-educated, well-read young man. He mentioned that he had not read Beowulf, having heard it was dry. This is not his fault. It is the fault of his preceptors. It is all the same more than a trifle dismaying. It is dismaying enough simply as a utilitarian matter. As is true of most of the instances in which we as a society have failed to transmit the culture we've received to newer generations, our failure has rendered a great deal of literature, past and present, mute, and its lessons with it. This is an unkindness and injustice to the reader. It is also a betrayal of the author's duty. All of you who are hearing these words have inherited a great privilege and a great wealth. You are its trustees. It is your duty to preserve the corpus of this inheritance, to augment it, not to diminish it nor to waste it, but rather to pass it on undiminished or improved to the generations which shall come after. Before ever I prepared this episode, I discovered a truly shocking incidence of the waste of this inheritance, which you may remember, some of you. In a now deleted post on social media, some miserable creature, a subliterate half-wit, asserted that the literary canon is white supremacy. Not, inaccurate as these should be, that it promotes it, or that it supports it, not that it enhances it, or that it enables it, not that knuckle-dragging mudsill kluxes try to co-opt it to such uses, which is all too true, but that the canon is white supremacy. I feel I need hardly note that this creature is himself, to all appearance, white as a bowl of grits. He asserted, whether honestly or no, that he'd been challenged on this by a white man. He did not say, as he ought to have said, by another, a fellow white man, who, he claimed, asked, did he mean to drop Faulkner or Sophocles? Astoundingly, according to his own retailing of this anecdote, true or not, he missed what to many should seem an open goal, and ignoring Faulkner, replied that he did intend to drop Sophocles from the canon, asserting that he thereby should reduce the boredom of the curriculum. It is probable he has not read Sophocles. He likely thinks Creon is a Crayola product. But one could imagine why he should be made uneasy by Sophocles, and especially by Antigone, whose name he quite likely pronounces as Antigone. The Theban plays, concerned as they are with hamartia, the lust of power, and civil disobedience, do not make comfortable reading for little fascists. Indeed, I suggested that he had better begin with Heinrich Heine, and particularly with Almansor. It is, of course, in that work that Heine notes that where they burn books, they shall sooner or later burn human beings. To this book-burning white boy's madness, one of his acolytes, a woman equally white, responded worshipfully with a post gleefully setting out her school's binning of old, unsuitable, unapproved books. That post also has been deleted, but a screenshot remains, and I put it here. Look at the state of it. Hershey on Hiroshima. The Oxbow incident. Materially important and thought-provoking works of literature, but outdated now because presumably insufficiently woke or insufficiently relevant, or requiring too much work and thought, or simply old. This is madness. It is also imprudent for authors. The proper and native food of the writer is books. We can speak, only by virtue of the words of those who have gone before, and we write well when and only when we have the full panoply of previous literary references available to our hands. There's an old story, beloved of the Texas bar, in which the sort of trial lawyer who always describes himself as just a simple country lawyer, Judge, finds himself beleaguered by motions in limine, adverse rulings, sustained objections, and in the end admonished from the bench, "Lawyer Smith, you're going to have to try this case on the merits. Without theatrics, insinuations, ambushes, appeals to emotion, misdirection, sleight of hand, and all the rest of your bag of tricks." To which counsel replies, "But Judge, you have just stripped me of half the weapons in my arsenal." We now live in a world in which, voluntarily and wittingly, without its having been imposed upon them by others, authors have, either as a matter of personal preference, or in the belief that their market, their audience, requires them to do so, abandoned any cultural references which are not of the immediate moment. In so doing, they have given away the potential of evoking and invoking matter which should enrich their writing. They have not only stripped themselves of their own volition of half the weapons in their armories, they have unilaterally disarmed. What possible relevance, what utility have these old dead Greeks and Romans? What these awful myths of an oppressive religion? Well, there are in this world, and in its graveyards of not so long ago, those who have gone forth out of this world, women and men who find relevance and use in these, who thought thoughts not your own and your friends, who thought differently to you in your coterie of bros. If you are writing the history of their times, their thoughts are relevant, and understanding them is useful. If you are writing a fictive history of such times as they knew, when many more shared their thoughts and religion than do you and your friends, their thoughts are relevant, and understanding them useful. If you are creating characters who are to be like people yet in this world, who find relevance and use in these, who think thoughts not your own and your friends, who think differently to you and your broterie, you must find their thoughts, however alien, however you disapprove them, useful and relevant and worth understanding. Or you can write nothing save your thoughts and those of your like-minded friends, and write nothing worth publishing or reading or remembering, and, having written nothing worth, cease to write at all. What possible relevance, what utility have these old dead Greeks and Romans? What these awful myths of an oppressive religion? Well, let us think. There's nothing new in fiction set in the age of sail about a sea captain, a naval officer, with a flighty society wife. But let that captain accept that it is his duty to be at the forefront of battle, and that it is there that glory and promotion are to be found. Yet let him wonder if his admiral, Welsh as Lloyd George, and named Welshly David or Davis, orders him into danger because the admiral knows and too openly admires his wife, and you have something. Even if the captain is being paranoid and doing the admiral and his own wife an injustice. Brutish, bull-necked heavies are a dime a dozen, but tell me a book has the neck of the Minotaur and manners to match, and you have my attention. Your femme fatale is dangerously beautiful, seductive, and alluring, aren't they all? Persuade me rather that she, like Helen, is of a beauty capable of setting the world warring, were it not that she, like Circe, reduces man, save one or two whom she chooses, to grunted, swinish inarticulacy. What possible relevance, what utility have these old dead Greeks and Romans? What these awful myths of an oppressive religion? Well, how many of you had a great-grandparent or a grandparent in the Great War? Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Rupert Brooke, buried, significantly enough, on Skyros, where Achilles once hid in drag. The wounded Macmillan reading Aeschylus in the trenches. The Anzacs upon Lemnos stand in the trench Achilles flame-capped. It was lost upon none, then or now, that the Hellas memorial and Gallipoli as a battlefield face across the Hellespont to the Troad. Even in the Second World War there were echoes of the classical, as on Crete in the kidnapping of General Krypin. And throughout, the appeals and yes, the propaganda were rooted deeply in the classical past as mediated through the medieval past, and were made in quasi or explicitly religious terms. Don't tell me that these things are not relevant to you today, when they were relevant to those without whom you would not be here, and of whom you can attain no understanding unless you understand their mental world. Theirs and ours. You likely don't know many lads named Beowulf, but we're up to our asses in Jason's. Jason and the crew of Argo passed through the Dardanelles too. In that story, the Argo sailors, the Argonauts, a form knowingly adopted as the template for astronaut and cosmonaut, made port on passing through the Hellespont on the peninsula of Cyzicus. They left a thank offering at a spring above Artake town by a gnarled and ancient tree, the anchor stone. And they were feasted by the locals, a civilized people who claimed descent of Poseidon, the Doliones, under their king Cyzicus. Sadly, upon their leaving to sail on, a storm drove them back, and they sheltered in a cove on the other side of the island, for the peninsula was an island then, and thought themselves on a different and unknown coast. The Doliones, in turn, thought them raiders, and a night battle ensued, as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night, to borrow from Matthew Arnold's poem Dover Beach, a night battle in which Cyzicus was killed. His new queen killed herself. The Argonauts atoned for the error, establishing new religious rites there, and, the gods being appeased, sailed on. It is said that to avert ill luck and ill omen, the crew, as the rites of departure were offered, danced a high-stepping and leaping dance in armor, clashing their swords and spears against their shields to drown out the sound of the Doliones' mourning of their king and queen. That tale is a Bronze Age tale. In the Bronze Age, the future or proto-Turkic peoples lived far from the Black Sea, on the steppes of Central Asia. Cue the Borodin, maestro. Well within living memory of the middle-aged amongst us, the Turks of the Kapida Peninsula, in the town of Erdek and its countryside, have, with conical helmet, round shield, and curved scimitar, danced a high-stepping and leaping dance in armor, clashing their swords against their shields on special occasions, and by an ancient spring have long made a gnarled and ancient tree into a wishing tree, hung with votive images no matter what imams may say. That spring is, and has always been called, Jason's Spring, and the Kapida Peninsula is the peninsula of Cyzicus. Under a new people utterly alien to the place and its history and story, and in defiance of their own religion's strictures, the Bronze Age rites persist unto this day, and we in the West are yet up to our asses in Jasons. As the great historian of the English landscape and of manorial history, W.G. Hoskins, repeatedly noted, everything is older than we think. Not long ago, I posed a series of questions several times over on social media to gauge the cultural literacy of the writing community. We shall now pause for a brief interlude whilst I put those on the screen. Have you had a chance to read and answer them? We'll come back to them. Note, by the way, that some of these, which may seem trivial, are designed to illuminate what C.P. Snow referred to as the two cultures problem. What I wish to emphasize is this, that literary references in your fiction evoke and invoke all that has been said, written, painted, and indeed set to music of their source material. Yes, set to music, for I defy any cultivated person not to hear Handel's setting when she sees certain scriptural passages quoted or referred to, and not to hear Bach when presented with a scene of contented, peacefully grazing sheep. Properly used, such references deepen and enrich your prose and your story. They render your characters and your tale no longer flat and stale and unprofitable, but rounded and three-dimensional. And it is your duty as a writer to aid in the transmission of the cultural and literary heritage of which you are a beneficiary, passing it on to new and future generations. Your duty. And too many of you are shirking it. You accept its privilege for yourself and hoard it, denying it to others. For you acquired that privilege, after all, by just such a means of transmission by and through an older generation of writers and artists. But let us be merely utilitarian, if we must. If you have not read, or better heard, the front half of Beowulf, you'd probably best not watch any westerns. Not Shane, or Pale Rider, not The Shootist, not even The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. If, as I'd expect the ever-brilliant Dr. Dmitri Fehmy should agree, you've not read the back half of Beowulf, you shan't fully get the end of The Hobbit. You certainly shan't get the deep layers there, not least the deep layers of irony. After all, the ending of Beowulf concentrates upon Beowulf. It is Beowulf, king and hero, who confronts the dragon, the Wyrm. But in Beowulf, the dragon attacks Beowulf's kingdom because it has been robbed of a golden cup, a kylix, a chalice, robbed by a bondman, a serf, a slave on the run, who entered the barrow to escape a whipping. Yes, my choice phrase just there is meant to recall Hamlet. Use every man after his desert, and who should scape whipping. In The Hobbit, the Beowulf figure, Bran, descendant of Geryon, Lord of Dale, is a bit player. The contest is between Smaug the dragon and Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and Bilbo, that most respectable and counted gentry hobbit, plays the role of the Theban serf. Bran himself is, as yet, no king, a dispossessed royal, a mercenary captain in the service of Esgaroth, a Beowulf adherent, not yet king. To that extent he is in something of the position of Aragorn before the War of the Ring. A Beowulfine character, a king slaying Smaug, should require to be a Thorin or a Thranduil. Tavers is said to have complained of his friend Jack Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia that it had the fault of containing within it elements which had no relation one to another and which could not logically exist together in a single fictional world. He seems to have had in mind, for example, the appearance of Father Christmas in Narnia. Lewis replied that these quite comfortably existed together in his imagination. He might also have said, from the author's world-building perspective, and this was certainly the case in his space trilogy, that as Narnia was created to be ruled over by humans after the Incarnation, and had as its first monarchs the very English King Frank and Queen Helen, it was meet and right that Christmas should have a certain memory in Narnia. But from the point of view of literary criticism, the distinction here is in fact between epic and saga. Ariosto contains just such a miscellany. The Sorger do not. Beowulf is, after all, a confessedly Christian poem, as we now have it, about unequivocally pagan warriors. Orlando Furioso, like Orlando Innamorato, like the Chanson d'Orléans, like the Matter of Britain, and especially the Morte d'Arthur, is not. And even in pagan antiquity, the epic, as a Mediterranean form, is diffuse, filigreed, diverse in its sources, acquisitive and unashamed of appropriating anything to hand wherever from, as saga, even post-conversion saga, is not. The Edur, Heimskringla, the Ornamentation, Brunndalssaga, all have a terrible consistency in circumscription, as do such allied cycles as the Caluala, and one could argue the Irish cycles, at least the Fenian and Ulster cycles, and also the Mabinogion. Of course, even the purest saga can rove into the province of epic. The Lord of the Rings is saga, but I agree with LMH's Richard Jenkins that Ithilien is Italy, Virgil's poetic Italy, in its flora and clime, its, significantly, disheveled dryad loveliness. Yet saga, the work remains, as stark and uncompromising and beautiful in its strict utility as a battle axe, a phrase I half-inched from Wemsey, just as it is in Harald Særkozy, Harald Hardrade having, after all, served in the Varangian Guard before returning to seize power in Norway, in which effort his mercenary experience stood him in good stead, though not, I'm happy to recall, good enough stead to keep the invading bastard from being defeated and killed at Stamford Bridge, and good riddance too. Pity the same didn't befall William the Bastard of Normandy. And this too is significant, that Roland at Roncesvalles Pass, El Cid Campeador in Valencia, Harold against Harold at Stamford Bridge, Gangar Hrolf in the conquest of Normandy, exist at once in epic and saga, and in sober military history. Opened by reference, by evocation and invocation, a crack in your world, and all the past, all hell and all heaven come flooding in. And it is the Nile which is in flood. It enriches, it fructifies. That is the soil in which your story takes root and flourishes. This cannot happen if your characters, your world, and your story are all unwindowed monads, dominating in a vacuum. And who the hell wishes to read that? There are many ways in which the thread of a literary heritage may be lost. War and invasion, religious revolutions and reformations, civilizational collapse, such as the Bronze Age collapse in the Mediterranean, plague and mass death, or, as we have seen, by deliberate self-infliction. But story, like Dame Nature, is subtle and inexorable as a Nanke and Nemesis. You may drive her out with a pitchfork, yet will she and shall she find her way back in. Chrysophylax Dives, in Farmer Giles of Ham, is a dragon in the literary tradition of Kenneth Grahame and his reluctant dragon. The dragons of Arda, Smaug, and Uncalagon the Black are assuredly not. Twee Victorian fairies are nothing like the Alfar, the Longevi, but after a few false starts, Tolkien reserved these to the Father Christmas letters, and the old true elves, undiminished, Kipling's, Puck's, peoples of the hills, populate Middle-earth as they populated the ancient imagination. Story always reasserts herself. The critic's approach, and not modern critics only, to the Iliad never ceases to amaze me. Take, for example, its best, some would say its only, remembered episode, that of the Trojan horse. It is not alone recent or modern critics who have professed to find this incomprehensible. They, looking back across a chasm of civilizational collapse, pour cold and acid scorn on the idea that the Greeks, having left a votive offering to Poseidon and ostentatiously sailed away over the horizon, could hope to count upon the Trojans taking the damned thing within the walls. But the horse is sacred to Poseidon, who is the god of horses, earthquakes, and ships in the sea, which is why Poseidon Hippios, Earthshaker, Master of Waters, or his Hittite counterpart Luwian or Hattic, is likewise the patron god of Ilion, of horse-breeding, earthquake-enduring seaport Wilusa of the Hittites. Hittite religion and Achaean, Mycenaean religion have a right smart of mutual echoes and no little cross-pollination, from Poseidon to Dionysius to Ares to Apollo to the dragon-serpent Python. Of course the Trojans are going to seize, to appropriate, to reappropriate the Trojan horse, to take its mana, to transfer its blessings to themselves as spoils of war. Any critic who cannot see that, as it were instinctively, has forgotten what it was to be a child, and, as most critics have been men, has forgotten what it was to be a small boy. For the Homeric heroes, like all archaic warrior heroes, like all primitive peoples so-called, have everything in common with small boys. This is not because they are childish, it is because they are natural. Children preserve in every generation they recapitulate unvarnished and untutored human nature, braggart, swaggering, covetous, ungracious in victory, plundering, red in tooth and claw, until they are tutored and varnished, until they are made civilized. This is not a laudatory view of childhood, please note, any more than is Golding's Lord of the Flies, nor does it pretend the little hellions have a native innocence or any of that Enlightenment romantic twaddle. But it is an accurate statement all the same, and all the more. One deep source of our imagination, of our literary tradition, is then pagan, Greek, Roman, Norse. In short, Athens in Tertullian's old query. But what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What has Ingeld to do with Christ? This is, in fact, the wrong question, or rather, these are the right questions the wrong way round, as witness the dream of the Rood. What matters is what Jerusalem makes of Athens, what Christ has to do with Ingeld. For the other deep source of our imagination and our literary traditions is the metaphorical Jerusalem, the heritage of Christendom, and its source in Judaism, in the Old Testament to Christians, in the Tanakh. And this is so even in the post-Christian West, in the lands of Islam, and in those portions of the world in which Christianity is at best a minority religion. China, for example, possesses an ancient civilization and a culture which need yield to none, marred and corrupted though it is by the current criminal de facto government in Beijing, upon which there has been very little influence from the Christian West. Yet Bach is beloved there, and you cannot have Bach without the entire history of Christendom behind him. You need not be the brilliant and learned Tom Holland, or the great Motown songwriting team of Holland, Dozier, Holland, who brought us so many of the greatest hits of soul, Carolina beach music, and northern soul, to realize that much of our language and our music traces back to a source with which many of you shall be uncomfortable. As I wrote in Benevolent Designs, there is more theology in many of the Wesley's hymns than in John's sermons, and they extended the principle that the law of prayer is the law of belief from the spoken liturgy to the hymns as well. More than that, it is from American Methodism, with its rollicking hymns, that the churches of the holiness movement, black and white, derive. The beginnings of Pentecostalism are in the Azusa Street Revival. That revival, in turn, stemmed largely from the Welsh revival of 1904-1905, deeply rooted in Welsh Calvinistic Methodism and the influence of Lady Huntington's Trevecca Seminary, for all that the holiness movement is necessarily Wesleyan and Arminian with its stress upon Christian perfectibility. And it was notably interracial and integrated from the start, whatever may have come afterwards, to the outrage of contemporary observers. There would be neither country and western music, nor rock and roll, neither R&B nor pop, without the musical traditions of Methodist, Holiness, and Baptist church choirs in America. No Willie, no Waylon, no Carter family, no Johnny Cash. No Ella, she grew up AME Zion. No Fats Waller, the preacher's son. No Charles Ives or Aaron Copland. No Barry White, no Aretha Franklin, no B.B. King, no Coco Taylor, no Leadbelly, no Bob Wills, no Wycliffe Jean, no John Mellencamp. Musically, no Grateful Dead either, for that matter. No CCR, no CSNNY, no Levon Helm of the band, and certainly no Jerry Lee Lewis, no Elvis, no Allman Brothers, no Lynyrd Skynyrd. American music in all genres derives a ponderable portion of its heritage from this music that is at once Mahalia's and Mother Maybell's. Somewhere or other, Miss Sayers has Lord Peter Wimsey's mother, the inimitable Dowager Duchess, observed that with the metaphysical poets such as Donne, and later iterations such as Browning for that matter, one is never quite sure whether they're addressing their mistress or the established church. Well, Fontella Bass's Rescue Me could pass pretty easily for a hymn from the traditions of the black church in America. And reasonably enough, as noted in Fontella Bass's obituary in the New York Times, December 27, 2012, when we were recording Rescue Me, I forgot some of the words. Back then, you didn't stop while the tape was running, and I remembered from the church what to do if you forget the words. I sang and it worked out just fine. Indeed, most American music could so pass, not least in its gospel-style call and response antiphony, which appears in pop, in rock, and notably in swing, count basses especially. Ain't No Mountain High Enough could almost come from Romans 8:35-39. Ride the Mighty High has crossed over from gospel music, as has Oh Happy Day. People Get Ready has touched souls that Reverend Al and Curtis Mayfield never dreamed of reaching. Mahalia Jackson's singing John Newton's hymn Amazing Grace is a thread strong as a ship's cable, linking the Countess's circle to modern American music even at its most secular. And if you cannot imagine Aretha without Ella, you equally cannot imagine Aretha without Mahalia. American music, of course, has in turn gone on to influence the popular music of most of the globe. We live, like it or not, and despite the best efforts of some, in a common world culture. To the despair of many of you, and despite the best efforts of many of you, that culture is, as a matter of historical happenstance, Anglo-American, British, North American, and Commonwealth. It is the consequence of centuries of British and American predominance. As such, it is, although in many places post-Christian now, Christ-haunted, as Flann O'Connor said. It is yet discernibly and broadly Protestant or Anglican. It reaches back ultimately to classical, Hellenistic, and Roman roots, and to Western European roots, and to Jerusalem. It remembers Hieront and Herod, Troy and Telamonian Ajax, and Twain, and the music of Telamon, Chrysias and Christ, Sigurd and Siegfried, and Solomon. Its language is rooted therein, and language shapes thought. That language, in turn, is the legacy of Chaucer, Milton, Bunyan, Cranmer, Shakespeare, and the authorized version, what is often called the King James Bible. When the first woman governor of Texas, Maul Ferguson, a sort of Hillary Clinton figure elected in the place of her impeached and disgraced husband, Governor Paul Ferguson, was on the campaign trail and opposing bilingual education in the Rio Grande Valley, she uttered the immortal line, "If in the English language was good enough for Jesus Christ, it's good enough for the school children of Texas." Culturally, granting the influence of the authorized version, this is not quite as stupid as it sounds and was. Here is a passage from the private papers of Henry Rycroft by George Gissing. "There is as much difference," said Johnson, "between a lettered and an unlettered man as between the living and the dead." And in a way it was no extravagance. Think merely how one's view of common things is affected by literary association. What were honey to me if I knew nothing of Hymettus and Hybla? If my mind had no stores of poetry, no memories of romance? Suppose me town pant. The name might bring with it some pleasantness of rustic odor, but what poor significance even that, if the country were to me mere grass and corn and vegetables, as to the man who has never read nor wished to read? For the poet is indeed a maker. Above the world of sense trodden by hidebound humanity, he builds that world of his own whereto is summoned the unfettered spirit. Why does it delight me to see the bat flitting at dusk before my window, or to hear the hoot of the owl when all the ways are dark? I might regard the bat with disgust, and the owl either with vague superstition or not heed it at all. But these have their place in the poet's world, and carry me above this idle present. I once passed a night in a little market town, where I had arrived tired and went to bed early. I slept forthwith, but was presently awakened by I knew not what. In the darkness there sounded a sort of music, and as my brain cleared, I was aware of the soft chiming of church bells. Why, what hour could it be? I struck a light and looked at my watch. Midnight. Then a glow came over me. We have heard the chimes at midnight, Master Shallow. Never till then had I heard them, and the town in which I slept was Evesham, but a few miles from Stratford-on-Avon. What if these midnight bells had been to me but as any other, and I had reviled them for breaking my sleep? Johnson did not much exaggerate. The honey of Hymettus and Hybla. To those who know, Hymettus is an ancient mountain and eponymous range hard by Athens, noted for wild honey, marble, and the ancient temple of Zeus Umbrios, Zeus the rain-giver. It is Zeus-haunted. It is the source of the river Ilissus, divinely important to early Athens, celebrated by Plato as part of the city's defenses, known to Socrates, and a place of teaching where he and his students walked and he lectured beneath the grove of plane trees. And what of Hybla, now Ragosa Ibla in Sicily, and its honey? Celebrated by Theocritus, hymned by Virgil, made metaphor by Ovid, invoked by Shakespeare, evoked by Keats, and used for film in the adaptations of the Inspector Montalbano series. What of bees themselves? Willie the Shakes singing masons building roofs of gold. You may use them as a metaphor for being busy. You may use the structure of their honeycombs as a symbol for social relations, as Dorothy L. Sayers did. You may recall Samson's riddle, and thus Tate and Lyle and 1,000 nursery teas. There is no end to the train of associations started by almost anything. You may consider the bees' dances. You may consider the meadows and wildflowers, which are their places of labor. Remember what Aragorn said of the earth itself, that mythic ground and ground of myth, to Aemma. Earth the mother, the greensward, the countryside, the fields we know, the little familiar other Eden, demi-paradise, the green fields of which the dying Falstaff babbled, Langland's fair field full of folk, the ancestral meadow where baseball and cricket are played. Think upon water. It is very anciently a natural altar, and well into Plantagenet times swords and humble saws alike were cast into it in propitiation by Christians, just as Chalcolithic man their ancestors had done. And from Cape Town to Calgary to Canberra, from Beijing to Bradford to Baltimore to Bogota, every public fountain and every twee wishing well still accepts and gets those offerings. Or contemplate the woodland, ironwood, milkwood, the wood at the world's end, the green wood in which Robin and his merry men go clad in Lincoln green, a place of fear, the haunt of Pan, Dante's darkling wood, the home of Wolfe and Woodrow's the wild wood, or the site of freedom in the realm of the ants, the onodrim. Or consider the ant, thou sluggard, and grow wise, mindless marching myrmidons, or the thrifty and prudent contrasted with the grasshopper. You have before you in spread abundance a feast, and you have chosen to starve. You have been granted immeasurable treasure, uncounted wealth, mind refined and ready for your use, for ornamentation, for you to bestow upon your readers, even if it be subliminally, coming to them as the half-heard horns of Elfland dimly blowing, as half-remembered tales, and you are content with IKEA, and not even as a stylistic choice, but because of your own poverty of imagination, or for fear of what Mrs Grundy, your reader, might think at being forced to think. Let us look again at the questions I posed. Musically, I'm a little taken aback at how few respondents knew that the answer to the first question was Birdland, whether the Weather Report original, Maynard Ferguson's or Buddy Rich's covers, or the vocalese version by the Manhattan Transfer. It's more disturbing how few people know that the role of Fafner is sung by a bass. That may admittedly be because my view of tenors is the same as Chaliapin's, and for like reasons. Wang Chung's Jack Hughes deserved better of the respondents whom j'accuse, and I was shocked to see how quickly the classic Top Gear intro has been forgotten. This is doubly true of Booker T and the MG's Soul Limbo. More serious to me is the danger of fallacies, which is why I was alarmed that so few recognized 4 Aristotelian syllogisms. There is no excuse for failing to recognize the Epic of Gilgamesh. And though Thomas the Rhymer is a good Scots answer, there's less excuse still amongst authors for the paucity of votes which went to Homer and Virgil. Similarly, it's alarming, I blame Medea, that the story of the Golden Fleece goes unrecalled for all that were up to our Isis and Jasons, particularly when it had such power over the Western imagination as to be the highest, or one of the highest, chivalric orders of Burgundy, Spain, and the Habsburg dual monarchy. I had also hoped that Pache Snow, the two cultures were not so far apart that more people than said so know that Max Born was Olivia Newton-John's grandfather, and that the Musikvereins Goldenzaal and the Concertgebouw are what they are because of their shoebox proportions. It is troubling how few people remember the Alice books and the Dormouse, or have any idea of the habits of Dormouse, nibbling away at Dame Julian's hazelnut. It is inexcusable for them to know so little of Handel, and to have so forgotten the Iliad, Trojan horses and all. Equally, it is shocking that although a few people have heard of and remember Nelson's Victory and Old Ironsides and Columbus's ships, Raleigh's Golden Hind is forgotten, and, speaking of the Golden Fleeces of Colchis, Argo is unknown. That is not an era into which such civil servants with side jobs as Chaucer, Cervantes, and Pepys should have fallen. I said in the first episode that I am the sworn enemy of the chronocentric arrogance of presentism, the notion, taken from Whig history and from misapplied half-assed subliterate popular Darwinism, that history has always been aiming at producing as its crowning glory our own sweet selves. I regret to say that of those who know anything about music and essayed the question, presentism alone can explain the failure to account for the Baroque period, the period of Pachelbel, Telemann, Corelli, Vivaldi, and of course of George Frederick Handel and of Johann Sebastian Bach, recognized even by rock experts such as Rick Beato and rock gods such as Procol Harum as the greatest composer ever to have lived. Equally, this is the likely culprit for the general failure to name either Mozart as the great musical prodigy. Secularism seems also to be at work here, as with the silence on hymns, spirituals, and anthems, whether Purcell's or Mother Maybelle Carter's or the Wesleys, or Perry's and Elgar's and RVW's. And yet, if you were required to choose a representative song for the United States, you'd almost certainly choose Will the Circle Be Unbroken, and if you didn't, you'd choose Poor Wayfaring Stranger, or I'll Fly Away, or I Saw the Light, or New Orleans Band playing Just a Closer Walk with Thee on the way to Cimetière Saint-Louis, and When the Saints Go Marching In on the way back, and you bet a second line. Even as for the UK, your choices perforce include Jerusalem, St. Patrick's Breastplate, I Vow to Thee, My Country, Gwahodhiad, Cumrantha, some Vaughan Williams, and something from the Kirk's metrical psalter, such as most likely Old Hundredth. Similarly, presentism alone can explain why, with all due credit to FDR and Lincoln and Dr. King and even Winston, no one recalled those masters of the music of rhetoric from whom all these learned their trade, Pericles and Demosthenes and Cicero, or even Elizabeth I at Tilbury or Archbishop Woolston long before. In the same way, it is dismaying how few respondents recognize that the English we speak is in its origins the speech of the authorized version of the BCP, Shakespeare, Chaucer, and Milton. Finally, I admit that Beijing and Karakorum and Xanadu and Tokyo, Babylon and Nineveh, Paris and Rome, London and New York are justly famous, as are Bach and Samarkand and Mohenjo-daro. And I was amused that friends who know me well cheekily suggested Richmond, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, and Houston. But, Aeneas, that model of filial piety, Odysseus, the wily, sulking Achilles, the brave and noble Hector, Cassandra, the face that launched 1,000 ships, Dido and her lament, the sound of 100 remembrance Sundays, even under the fictive Brutus long pretended to have founded the new Troy of London. There's one poem about one city which has obsessed the world for millennia. The heroes of the war which occurred there are commemorated as founders, mythic founders, and recalled throughout the Mediterranean and into the British Isles and beyond the Hindu Kush to the banks of Indus and to the borders of the Han Empire and at the last into the Punjab. And where the British colonized North America, their names are attached to towns and cities. For this vision, men have broken their backs and their hearts and their minds, their fortunes and their reputations, even as Schliemann did. Men have appropriated the tale, as Virgil did. The tale of Troy is the founding myth, told, mourned, honored, celebrated by its very enemies, and then embraced by those who pretended to be the successors of the gloriously defeated, the founding myth of Western civilization in one half of its source. And what of that other half? If I forget thee, may my right hand forget its cunning. Next year in Jerusalem, Jerusalem, my happy home, the new Jerusalem, building Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven, saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them, and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And he that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. I first drafted this in October, which culminates in the vigil of the Feast of All Souls. For far too many writers, that means writing or timely publishing horror or ghost stories, which are two very different things. Well, why is so much of it so stunningly piss poor? Why else but this? Mere gore is material and may be wallowed in by the materialist. But those who do not believe in the immortality of the soul in some form, or who cannot at least understand that belief, who have not become familiar with it, can't write decent ghost stories for sour apples or toffee. Their haunts are evident and threadbare literary devices, and we can see the wires. Their special effects suck. They write with conviction, merely appropriating a tradition they're no part of. And unlike an M.R. James or a Susan Hill or a George Knight, they foolishly decline to use the trappings, indeed the vestments, of the tradition, of Canon Alberic and Abbot Thomas, Nicholas Franken and Count Magnus and Dr. Rant, Archdeacon Haynes and Dr. Ashton, the prebendary of Whitminster, the dean and chapter of Southminster Cathedral. They avoid the private chapel of Broxstone Court, Fulnaker Priory, the crypt of St. Oswald's. And horror is in the same piss-poor state, wallowing in gore, yet bloodless. And why not? Ghoulish thingamies and aliens and old gods are, in literary terms, angels sent to aid us or to execute judgment upon us for our sins, or demons from beyond the sublunary sphere allowed to torment us because of our evils. It is too much to expect that writers who have chosen to cut themselves off from millennia of tradition should use its tropes competently and convincingly. As Odysseus learnt, trying to find his way back to Ithaca, the dead answer questions only if you stand them a drink of warm blood. No one who can claim to be a writer, no one who can claim to be writing, to be transmitting our common culture to her readers, to his heirs, no one fit to put pen to paper or finger to keyboard and write for publication, has any excuse for not availing himself of these prepared riches of connotation and association to enrich her work, to convey to the next generation the heritage she is privileged to have been given to correct popular taste. The use of these materials, ready to hand, and each starting a train of association in the reader's mind if he has one, is the surest means of enriching, adorning, heightening, and deepening your work. The use of these rich resources also prevents the authors falling into cliché. Outworn and shop-worn references, fossilized formulae, cannot withstand, nor can they prevail against, new and original uses of the old canons. To paraphrase Supertramp, they keep on shining like brand new. You have been granted riches in a little room. You have before you for your use the entirety of an ancient common culture. For the love of God, use it. You have before you a feast, and you the master of the revels. What sort of miserly and miserable creature are you to continue ladling out thin gruel? Your readers are not so many Oliver Twists. Stop sniveling over your self-imposed poverty, enter upon your goodly inheritance, and get to work. Here endeth the lesson. Next time we'll be looking at mood, theme, and the least of these things, plot, and I don't mean hounds. This has been episode 2 of The Writing Life with your host, Markham Shaw Pye. Like it or not,